Welcome to Mystery Vault, the ultimate destination to discover the hidden side of history. Today we will talk about Jews, Hebrews, Israelites, the chosen people. They are known by many names and are one of the oldest groups of people still inhabiting the world today. Yet, their true history remains relatively unknown. They made a covenant with a God whose name they are forbidden to even pronounce. From the earliest days of their history, they witnessed miracles and interacted with supernatural beings. Jewish sages and Kabbalists are keepers of an extraordinary arcane knowledge that few have access to. In this documentary, we will dive deep into the entire history of the Jews, from their origins to the present day. In 1896, the legendary Egyptologist and archaeologist Sir William Flinders Petrie made an incredible discovery in the sands of Thebes, Egypt. He and his team uncovered a 10-foot-high, 3 meters, black granite slab, completely covered in hieroglyphic scripture and drawings. This was a celebratory inscription made by Pharaoh Meneptah, who ruled Egypt between 1213 and 1203 BCE. As the fourth pharaoh of the 19th dynasty. Most of the Meneptah stele describes his victory against the Libyan invaders who had threatened his reign, as well as that of his predecessor, Rameses the Great. At the time, Libya was known as the Land of the Nine Bows, a reference to their unrivaled skill in ranged combat. Meneptah, however, crushed them by attacking from all sides with swift, agile cavalry. Egyptians were known for disliking empty spaces on their monuments, so at the end of the stele, when the account of the Libyan campaign was finished, the royal scribe added a few lines detailing another, minor campaign, this time to Canaan. The stele reads, "The princes are prostrate, saying peace. Not one raises his head among the 9 bows. Desolation is for Chehenu, Hatti is pacified, plundered is the Canaan with every evil. Carried off is Askaluni, seized upon is Giza, Yanoam is made non-existent. Israel is laid waste, its seed is no more. Karu has become a widow because of Egypt. All lands together are pacified. Everyone who was restless has been bound." One name stands out among the others, Israel. This is, in fact, the first written attestation of the name Israel. It is clear that they were well-established neighbors to Egypt and, even more significantly, a palpable threat to Egyptian power. Otherwise, they would not have been mentioned in such an important royal document. What is even more interesting is that the first known mention of the people of Israel describes their defeat. The stele claims, "Its seed is no more," implying that Egypt had killed every last one of the Israeli men. Perhaps they believed they had, but somehow the people of Israel managed to survive and build an impressive heritage. As we will see throughout this video, the themes of destruction, survival, and resurrection will recur often in Jewish history. According to the biblical books of Genesis and Exodus, the Israelites living in the Nile Delta were captured and enslaved by the Egyptian pharaoh. The traditional story goes that when the Egyptian kings decided to build the pyramids, they used Israeli slaves, whom they referred to as Hebrews. During the reign of Rameses II, also known as Rameses the Great, just before Pharaoh Meneptah published his now famous stele, a Hebrew prophet by the name of Moses arrived in Egypt. According to the Bible, he was called to free the Hebrew slaves by the one true God, Yahweh, who presented himself as a burning bush on Mount Horeb. Yahweh the God then sent Moses to assert his power and demand that the Egyptians free the Hebrews. Moses, along with his brother Aaron, appeared before the Pharaoh and asked him to free the Israelites. The Pharaoh then demanded Moses perform a miracle to prove his prophecy. Aaron threw down Moses' staff and it transformed into a giant snake. However, the Pharaoh was unimpressed and commanded his court magicians to do the same. The Egyptian magicians easily summoned snakes, but Moses' snake devoured the others. The Pharaoh took this as insolence and promptly expelled Moses and Aaron from his palace. Moses returned to the desert and relayed what had happened to Yahweh, who then took matters into his own hands. Yahweh commanded Moses to return to Egypt and ask the Pharaoh to free the Israelites once again. Moses did this 7 times, and each time the Pharaoh refused, Yahweh unleashed a new plague upon Egypt. At first, Pharaoh's magicians, who were much more powerful than Moses, easily countered the plagues. They turned the Nile to blood and summoned a plague of frogs. However, the third plague, an infestation of gnats or mosquitoes, proved harder to counter. Moses informed Pharaoh that the only way to end the plagues was for the Hebrews to worship Yahweh. Pharaoh then ordered the Hebrews in the Nile Delta to worship Moses' God, to rid themselves of the subsequent plagues, which included the death of livestock, boils, thunderstorms of hail and fire, and swarms of locusts. After the latter, Rameses the Great finally agreed to expel the Hebrews from Egypt, and they became followers of Moses, who led them to the desert east of the Nile. The 7 plagues of Egypt were not directed against the Egyptians themselves, but rather against the Hebrews living in Egypt. They were considered heathens because they had abandoned their original faith to live a prosperous, easy life in Egypt. This is further evidenced by another story from the Bible, which features the famous golden calf. When Moses went up to Mount Sinai to receive the 10 Commandments directly from God, the Israelites were left at the base of the mountain for 40 days and nights. They began to lose faith and even thought Moses had abandoned them and would not return, prompting them to defy the rules of Yahweh, the God, which forbade the worship of any image of a god. In fact, according to their religion, God cannot be looked at, depicted, or touched, and his name cannot even be spoken. Instead, the Israelites refer to him as Elohim, the plural for gods, or Adonai, my Lord. But they can never utter the 4 letters that make up Yahweh's name, known as the Tetragrammaton. While Moses was away, the Israelites became impatient and uncertain about his return. They asked Aaron to make them a god to worship. Aaron, under pressure from the people, collected gold from their jewelry and fashioned it into the shape of a calf. The Israelites then began to worship the golden calf, declaring it their god, which led to a great sin in the eyes of God. The bull is a very common deity in Egypt, known as Apis. Apis was a god of the underworld as well as of fertility, and since many Hebrews had lived in Egypt and were concerned about finding food in the desert, it was only natural that they turned to Apis for help, offering him sacrifices and burnt offerings. Meanwhile, Moses was up the mountain speaking to God. He received 2 tablets made of stone, each engraved with 5 commandments, for a total of 10. These were the main laws every Hebrew needed to obey if they wanted to please Yahweh, the God. However, when Moses came down and saw the calf, he was furious, as the Hebrews had broken 2 of the commandments. Thou shalt have no other gods before me, and thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image. He burned the golden calf in a fire, ground it to powder, mixed it with water, and forced the Israelites to drink it. According to the biblical text, not every Israelite adored the calf. At this point, a couple of clarifications about the origins of the Israelites are necessary. The traditional ancestor of all Israelites is the patriarch Jacob, the twin brother of Esau. Their mother, Rebekah, was told by Yahweh, the God, that her 2 children would grow up to found a great nation, but that Esau would end up serving Jacob. Esau founded Edom, and Jacob changed his name to Israel after encountering a mysterious stranger, an ancient astronaut who seemed to know all the secrets of the land. This was not the only meeting Jacob had with extraterrestrial beings. When he fled from his home in fear of his brother and sought refuge in Mesopotamia, he had a dream in which he saw a strange device that connected Earth and space. Not knowing a better term for this transportation machine, he called it a ladder, and he could see extraterrestrials, which he deemed angels, traveling between earth and the skies. This is when Jacob met Yahweh, the God himself. Yahweh descended to earth to inform Jacob that he had made a covenant with his grandfather, Abraham. He promised Jacob that his people would rule the land of Canaan, provided he had many children to populate it. So, Jacob had 3 children and established himself in Egypt with some of them, while others dispersed throughout northern Africa and Asia. His children each formed an independent tribe or extended family. However, the biblical story names only 2 tribes of Israel, and there has been speculation regarding what happened to the lost 3rd tribe. We will revisit this topic later. The Bible is filled with stories about people who lived incredibly long lives, and intriguingly, all of these individuals had encounters with extraterrestrial beings. Jacob died in Egypt at the age of 47, 500 years before Moses came to rescue the Hebrews from Egypt. Now, returning to Mount Sinai and the golden calf, it is said that only one of the tribes, known as the Levites because they descended from one of Jacob's sons named Levi, refused to worship the golden calf. Consequently, they were spared by Moses, but he unleashed his wrath against the other tribes, killing between 3,000 and 23,000 Jews that very night. From that point onward, and solely because the Israelites engaged in the religious rites they had known for centuries, their entire generation was banned from entering the Promised Land. Only after they all died could their children finally establish themselves in Canaan, the land of honey and milk. Moreover, from that moment on, only members of the tribe of Levi could be considered Jewish priests. Now, who was this vengeful, incredibly cruel and destructive deity, Yahweh? Thanks to the efforts of historians, theologians, and archaeologists, we have come to learn a great deal about religions in the ancient Near East. However, there is one exception. His name remains shrouded in mystery, as it does not belong to any language spoken at that time. For this reason, it is speculated that his name is not of terrestrial origin, and for the same reason, his followers are prohibited from uttering it. Furthermore, Yahweh never disclosed his name to Jacob or Abraham. They spent centuries worshipping an unknown God before revealing the 4 Hebrew letters of his name to Moses. The origins of the cult of Yahweh are much clearer. The most widely accepted theory suggests that Yahweh originated as a minor deity in southern Canaan. The Canaanites worshipped a plethora of minor deities, including Yahweh, Asherah, the mother goddess, and Baal, who also appears in the Bible as a challenger to Yahweh's supremacy in Israel. In early Canaanite mythology, Yahweh and Baal were merely 2 of the 70 children of their main god, El. The Canaanites passed their worship of Yahweh, among others, to some nomadic tribes known as the Shasu, who then spread this worship throughout the ancient world, including Egypt. The first historical document mentioning Yahweh is an inscription dating back to the rule of Egyptian pharaoh Amenhotep III, a contemporary of Moses. At one point, the inscription refers to the Shasu of Yew, and early scholars assumed that Yew was the place of origin for the Shasu. However, this is unlikely due to the nomadic nature of the Shasu, who were constantly moving between northern Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, and Canaan. But Yahweh was not the typical Canaanite agricultural or weather god. He was a divine warrior. Ambitious and relentless, he sought to be revered as the only god in the pantheon. The first step was to take the place of the foremost god in the Canaanite pantheon, El. El was known in Canaan as the creator of heavenly armies, much like the ones Jacob had seen in the sky. As we have already noted, one of the authorized names of Yahweh, Elohim, begins with the name of the god El. In the Bible, there are several mentions of conflict between Yahweh and other Canaanite gods, but not with El, suggesting that at some point in time they either fused together or Yahweh took his place. Thanks to Erich von Däniken's books, we can explore these fascinating connections further. We are all familiar with the Anunnaki, an alien race of beings known for their incredible strength and superhuman size, who were considered gods in the ancient Sumerian pantheon. They landed in Mesopotamia thousands of years before the times of Abraham and Jacob. However, it is important to remember that Jacob had his encounters with Yahweh, the God, while living in Mesopotamia. This implies that there might be a connection between the Anunnaki and Yahweh, just as there is a connection between the Anunnaki and the Egyptian gods, such as Thoth, who is often regarded as the true builder of the Great Pyramids. Yahweh even makes references to fallen angels in the Bible, which are the giants known as the Nephilim. The Bible serves as a source of information not only about the nature of Yahweh, but also about how the original Jews lived. As we have seen, not every story in the Bible is based on concrete facts, but they all contain a grain of truth. For instance, let's examine a passage from the book of Ezekiel, one of the major prophetic books of both the Christian Bible and the Hebrew Bible, known as the Tanakh. The book records the 6 visions the prophet Ezekiel experienced during his exile in Babylon in the 6th century BCE. Ezekiel recounts his vision of a Merkava, or chariot. This vision became significant in the Middle Ages, giving rise to a whole school of Kabbalistic thought known as Merkava mysticism. In reality, Ezekiel's vision describes a close encounter with extraterrestrials. In his account, the heavenly chariot was driven by a likeness of a man, albeit a much larger one. The vehicle had 4 wheels and was pulled by 4 humanoid creatures, each with 2 pairs of wings and faces that blended animal and human features. This was essentially a spaceship, a vehicle used by ancient astronauts to travel to and from Earth. The Bible is replete with references to impossible vehicles, including Noah's Ark, a ship so massive that every species of animal on Earth fit inside it. The story of Noah also illustrates how the Bible is inspired by other texts from that time. The Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh, composed long before the Bible, features a similar myth about a great flood. In this narrative, the highest god, Enlil, decides to destroy the world with a flood because humans have become too noisy. The earth god Ea, the creator of humankind from clay, forewarns a hero named Utnapishtim about the impending destruction and provides him with instructions for building a giant boat to survive the flood. As we know, this story closely parallels that of Noah and the Ark from the Bible. Moreover, the similarities do not end there. The Babylonian creation myth, called Enuma Elish, closely resembles the creation described in Genesis, including the creation of the world from water, the separation of darkness and light, and the establishment of order by a single mighty divinity. The Bible also contains numerous accounts of sightings of heavenly beings. Some canonical Jewish texts, such as the Psalms, declare, "The heavens declare the glory of God," implying that the worship of Yahweh is not limited to humans on earth, but also extends to heavenly beings residing beyond the skies. Furthermore, the social structure of the early Jews is described in the Bible. Initially, they were nomadic and organized themselves into tribes led by a patriarch. Thus, the family or tribe became the most important social structure for them. And this situation persisted when they finally settled in Canaan, the Promised Land. As we have already seen, every Israelite who was alive during the Golden Calf incident was unable to enter the Promised Land. This included Moses, who was left behind when the tribes crossed the Jordan River, now under the leadership of his son Joshua. After 40 years in the desert, they were finally able to establish themselves in Canaan, building cities and a temple in Jerusalem. To achieve this, they exterminated the Canaanites who inhabited the region, citing their God-given right to the Promised Land. There they wrote and codified the Pentateuch or Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, and developed their religious practices. These practices included sacrifices and festivals like Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, and Passover. The Torah also outlines the dietary restrictions for Jews, who are forbidden to eat meat from camels, pigs, hares, and shellfish. Originally, each of the tribes was self-governed and coexisted without the need to establish a state. However, once in Canaan and faced with many powerful neighbors, the elders of all the Israeli tribes decided that they needed a king. A Jew named Saul was appointed as king, but his reign was short-lived, as he soon disobeyed Yahweh and was punished for it. Yahweh had him killed in battle against the Philistines. The next king of Israel and Judah was David. David also faced challenges, both from his neighbors and from the Israelites, who initiated a civil war that forced him to flee momentarily. However, he gathered support and returned to Israel, crushed the revolt, and forged a powerful and unified Israelite monarchy. He was a successful military leader, defeating the Philistines and avenging Saul, while also securing the borders of Israel. It is during this period in history that we can begin to discuss a true Israelite empire, which exerted dominance over the neighboring territories of Philistia, Moab, Edom, and Ammon, even managing to subdue the Aramaean city-states of Aram Zobah and Aram Damascus, making them vassal states. David was succeeded by his son Solomon. Solomon is remembered as a great king, famed for his wealth and sense of justice. He is also credited with building the first temple. This temple was located at a very important site, atop Mount Moriah in Jerusalem, precisely where Solomon's father, King David, had an encounter with an extraterrestrial angel. The Temple of Solomon was the first embodiment of the arcane knowledge passed down through generations, given directly to the Israelites by Yahweh. This is why many scientists and researchers have meticulously studied the meaning of each part of the temple. The Book of Kings describes in detail how the Temple of Solomon was constructed. The entrance to the temple was supported by two sturdy columns or pillars. The right one was called Jachin, meaning he establishes, and the left one was named Boaz, in his strength. These pillars embodied the duality of the cosmos. In medieval tarot cards, one can see that the high priestess is surrounded by two columns, one marked with the letter B and the other with the letter J. Beyond the duality represented by the columns, the temple was divided into three parts, as the number 3 was considered to symbolize God, perfection, harmony, and wisdom. The first part was a large courtyard with an altar for burnt offerings, where the people of Israel gathered to worship God. This area of the temple was public. The second part was the holy place, consisting of an enclosed room featuring a golden candlestick, a golden altar for incense, and a table. This room was not open to the public, but was accessible to Israelites when the priests officiated ceremonies. Finally, there was the Holy of Holies, which was forbidden to everyone except the high priest, and only once a year. Inside this mysterious room rested the Kaparet, or mercy seat, a gold lid placed over the Ark of the Covenant, featuring 2 gold cherubim at each end, symbolizing the space where Yahweh appeared and dwelled. This was associated with the rituals of Yom Kippur, the only day of the year when the Holy of Holies could be accessed. Solomon also undertook the rebuilding of numerous significant cities that had been destroyed, including Megiddo, Hazor, and Giza. Unfortunately, when he died around 96 BCE, the tension between the tribes of Israel escalated into another civil war. Solomon's successor was his son Rehoboam, who could not prevent the unified monarchy from splitting into 2 kingdoms: the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah, with Jerusalem as its capital. Separated and lacking strong leadership, the kingdom of Israel was conquered in 7 BCE by the Neo-Assyrian Empire. The kingdom of Judah managed to resist for a century, but was finally defeated in 586 BCE by the Neo-Babylonian Empire, leading to the enslavement of all the Israelites. After winning the Battle of Carchemish against the Egyptians, the Babylonians, under King Nebuchadnezzar, became the most important empire in the ancient world. They easily defeated the fragile kingdom of Judah, and Nebuchadnezzar chose to impose tribute on the Jews, which they paid for 3 years. After that, the Israelites revolted against Babylonia in what became known as the Jewish-Babylonian War, lasting from 601 to 586 BCE. During this time, Jerusalem was besieged at least twice, and ultimately, the Babylonian army entered the city, enslaved the population, and destroyed Solomon's temple. Nebuchadnezzar II destroyed Jerusalem in his 8th year of reign, or 587 BCE. 5 years later, the king deported all the Jews to Babylonia's capital city. The Jews remained there until 539 BCE, when the Neo-Babylonian Empire fell to the Achaemenid Empire. The Persian Achaemenids allowed the Jews to return to Judah, and 2 years later they began constructing the Second Temple. Most of the exiled Jews did not return to Jerusalem. Many settled in what is now northern Israel, Lebanon, and Syria. The period of captivity in Babylonia was significant for Jewish history because many canonical texts of the Jewish religion were written during this time, including most of the prophetic books, like Ezekiel's. Jeremiah also wrote about the exile, and other important texts, such as Daniel's, Susanna, Bel and the Dragon, the story of the 3 youths, and the books of Tobit and Judith, were written during the exile. Finally, the definitive redaction of the Pentateuch was completed in the Persian period after the exile. The Book of Lamentations is entirely dedicated to the Babylonian captivity. Importantly, it was during this period that the Hebrew alphabet was adopted and the Torah was redacted. With no central temple in which to gather, private practices based on the Torah became common, and many of the sacred rites of modern Judaism began during the exile in Babylon. In fact, it can be asserted that this was precisely when the Jewish religion began to take its current form. One of the main religious consequences of the exile was that Jews no longer organized themselves by tribes, but rather by smaller family groups that followed Jewish leaders, whether they were scribes, sages, or the prophets themselves. For this reason, when Babylonia fell and was conquered by the Persian Empire in 540 BCE, many Jews did not leave immediately for Judah, but chose to follow their prophets. According to the Holy Scriptures, only those Jews who adhered to the teachings of Ezra and Nehemiah followed them back to Judah and resumed their traditional practices. One of the main religious consequences of the exile was that Jews no longer organized themselves by tribes, but rather by smaller family groups that followed Jewish leaders, whether they were scribes, sages, or the prophets themselves. For this reason, when Babylonia fell and was conquered by the Persian Empire in 540 BCE, many Jews did not leave immediately for Judah, but chose to follow their prophets. According to the Holy Scriptures, only those Jews who adhered to the teachings of Ezra and Nehemiah followed them back to Judah and resumed their traditional practices. The rest chose to either remain in Babylonia or establish themselves elsewhere within the Persian Empire. Those Jews who returned to Judah, or Zion as they began to call the Promised Land, immediately started reconstructing the temple. This is why, regardless of where Jews were established in post-exilic times, this period is known to historians as the Second Temple period. It lasted approximately 600 years, during which the Second Temple stood in the city of Jerusalem before it was destroyed by the Romans. This was a highly conflictive period in which the Kingdom of Judah enjoyed a certain level of freedom, only to be later annexed by the Hellenistic Empire, the Ptolemaic Kingdom, the Seleucid Empire, and Rome. Soon after the conquest, Persian King Cyrus the Great issued a decree known as the Edict of Cyrus, encouraging exiles of different origins to return to their homelands. The edict also stipulated that the Jerusalem area would become an autonomous province within the Achaemenid Empire, governed by the Jews. Those Jews who returned to their homeland were even offered assistance in rebuilding the temple, which they did not refuse. The Persian era laid the foundations for a unified Judaic religion and the beginning of a scriptural canon. The final Torah, which had been redacted during the exile, was completed during the Persian period. It was the prophet Ezra who played a pivotal role in its promulgation. Initially, Jerusalem was reconstructed, and while the temple was completed, it did not hold the same significance and importance as it had during the times of Solomon. In 332 BCE, the Persian Empire was conquered by the Macedonian armies of Alexander the Great. Alexander did not remain long in any of his possessions, but continued conquering lands until he reached the Indus River. After turning back, he died in Babylon under mysterious circumstances at the age of 32. Following his death, his generals divided the empire among themselves, and Judea became a frontier region between the Seleucid Empire and Ptolemaic Egypt. Judea was considered a vassal state to the Ptolemies, and the governance of the region was entrusted to the hereditary office of the High Priest of Israel. This period of relative peace, between 300 and 200 BCE, saw the rise of Hellenistic Judaism, a syncretism that began among the Jewish diaspora in Alexandria and later spread to Judea and Antioch. During this time, the Hebrew Bible was translated from Hebrew and Aramaic into Koine Greek, which helped disseminate the traditions of Judaism among Jews from Alexandria and other parts of the Hellenistic kingdoms who had lost the ability to speak Hebrew or Aramaic. The importance of Jewish religious leaders also grew during this period. Jewish leaders were perceived by other empires as valuable allies, and for this reason, when the Seleucid king Antiochus III captured the Judea region for the Seleucid Empire, he made efforts to protect Jewish culture and institutions. However, this was not the case with the Roman Empire, which regarded Jews as an ignorant people who worshipped only one God. After Pompey's conquest of Judea in 63 BCE, he allowed the local leader Hyrcanus II to retain his role. However, in practice, Hyrcanus II held no real power, and the entire region was governed by a Roman official named Antipater. When Julius Caesar's civil war broke out back in Rome, he attempted to install one of his own men on the throne of Judea. However, Pompey, the conqueror of Judea, poisoned his candidate and beheaded his son, retaining the throne of Judea for himself and his sons, Phasael and Herod. Herod was appointed king of the Jews by the Senate of Rome in the year 37 BCE. His rule was notorious for its cruelty and tyranny. Herod's governance was despotic, and he sought to suppress any signs of discontent among the population, particularly the Jews. His secret police became infamous for monitoring and reporting the sentiments of the inhabitants directly to him. Protests were met with brutal punishment, and his opponents were frequently executed. According to Flavius Josephus, a Jewish historian, Herod maintained a bodyguard of 2,000 soldiers. One of the most infamous events of his reign was the so-called Massacre of the Innocents, as recounted in the Gospel of Matthew. According to Matthew, Herod ordered the execution of all male children who were 2 years old and younger in or near Bethlehem. This account has not been corroborated by other sources, particularly by Flavius Josephus, leading contemporary scholars to question its veracity.